A chill settled over Moscow. The city, blanketed in snow, seemed to hold its breath as an unusual event unfolded. The streets were quieter than usual, the air thick with anticipation and uncertainty. People went about their daily routines, but there was an undercurrent of tension that was impossible to ignore. The date? We don't know for sure, but rumors place it in early February 2025. It was a time when the world was already on edge, with geopolitical tensions running high, and the global community watching every move with bated breath. A US plane, shrouded in secrecy, touched down on Russian soil. The landing was swift and unannounced, catching many by surprise. The plane's arrival was not part of any scheduled diplomatic mission, adding to the mystery. The world watched, holding its breath. News channels across the globe interrupted their regular programming to cover the event. Social media buzzed with speculation and theories, each more elaborate than the last. What was this plane doing in the heart of Russia? Was it a covert mission, a high-stakes negotiation, or something else entirely? The lack of information only fueled the fire of speculation. Why now, in the midst of a raging war in Ukraine? The timing seemed too coincidental to be ignored. The conflict in Ukraine had already drawn in numerous international players, each with their own agendas and interests. The questions hung heavy in the air. Analysts and experts debated the implications, while ordinary citizens could only watch and wonder. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty and concern. This was not just another diplomatic visit. The stakes were higher, the risks greater. Every move was being scrutinized, every word analyzed for hidden meanings. The tension between the United States and Russia was palpable. Relations had been strained for years, and this unexpected event only added to the strain. Both nations were on high alert, their leaders treading carefully. The war in Ukraine had become a dangerous proxy conflict, with both sides locked in a bitter standoff. The arrival of the US plane in Moscow added a new layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. The arrival of this plane was a spark in a powder keg, a mystery begging to be solved. It was a moment that could tip the balance, for better or worse. Even as journalists scrambled for answers, official statements remained vague. The lack of clarity only heightened the sense of urgency and speculation. The US government acknowledged the plane's presence but offered little explanation. Their statements were carefully worded, revealing nothing of substance. They cited ongoing diplomatic efforts but refused to elaborate. The ambiguity left many questions unanswered, fueling further speculation. The Kremlin, tight-lipped as ever, mirrored the US's ambiguity. Their silence spoke volumes, leaving the world to wonder what was really happening behind closed doors. Don't miss out on the latest updates. Subscribe to our channel for more breaking news and in-depth analysis. To understand the significance of this event, we must rewind. We need to go back to the year 2022, a year that marked a turning point in modern history. The year is 2022. It was a time when the world was still grappling with the aftermath of a global pandemic, and geopolitical tensions were simmering just below the surface. Russia launches a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, shattering decades of relative peace in Europe. The invasion was swift and brutal, catching the world off guard and plunging the region into chaos. The world is plunged into a new era of geopolitical uncertainty. Nations scrambled to respond, and the global community was left reeling from the sudden outbreak of war in Europe. The United States, along with its NATO allies, condemns the invasion and throws its support behind Ukraine. Diplomatic channels buzzed with activity as leaders sought to coordinate their response. Military aid flows into the war-torn nation, while crippling sanctions target the Russian economy. The sanctions were designed to weaken Russia's ability to sustain its military campaign, but they also had far-reaching consequences for the global economy. The Kremlin, defiant, accuses the West of waging a proxy war against Russia. Russian officials doubled down on their rhetoric, framing the conflict as a struggle against Western imperialism. Fast forward to 2025. The world has changed in many ways, but the war in Ukraine remains a grim constant. The war in Ukraine grinds on, a bloody stalemate. Despite numerous attempts at peace talks and ceasefires, the conflict shows no signs of abating. Both sides are dug in, unwilling to back down. The front lines have barely shifted, and the human cost continues to mount. Millions are displaced, cities lie in ruins, and the threat of nuclear escalation looms over the conflict. The humanitarian crisis is staggering, with countless lives upended by the ongoing violence. Against this backdrop of war and mistrust, the arrival of a US plane in Moscow takes on an even more ominous tone. The diplomatic mission is shrouded in secrecy, fueling speculation and concern. The relationship between the United States and Russia is at its lowest point since the Cold War. Decades of diplomatic progress have been undone, and the specter of a new Cold War looms large. Gone are the days of arms control treaties and diplomatic summits. The mechanisms that once helped to manage tensions and prevent conflict have eroded. In their place, a dangerous mix of suspicion, hostility, and the very real possibility of miscalculation. The risk of an unintended escalation is ever present, with both sides on high alert. The stakes are incredibly high, and the world is watching, holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. The future remains uncertain, and the path to peace is fraught with challenges. In the absence of official confirmation, speculation ran rampant. Theories, both plausible and outlandish, swirled through the media and online forums. Was it a high-stakes diplomatic mission, a last-ditch effort to avert a wider conflict? Or was it something else entirely? Some whispered of a potential prisoner exchange. Relations between the two nations were strained, but back channels still existed. Could the plane be carrying a valuable asset, someone Russia desperately wanted back? Names like Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter detained in Russia on espionage charges, were thrown around. Others pointed to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Could this be a secret meeting between US and Russian officials, a desperate attempt to find a negotiated settlement to the conflict? The idea seemed far-fetched given the deep mistrust on both sides, but in this new era of global uncertainty, anything seemed possible. The world held its breath, caught between hope and skepticism. As the hours ticked by, a clearer picture began to emerge. The world was on edge, waiting for any sign of progress. Newsrooms buzzed with activity, and the air was thick with anticipation. Every second felt like an eternity as people clung to their screens, hoping for a breakthrough. Sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that the plane's arrival was indeed linked to a prisoner exchange. These sources, deeply embedded within the diplomatic circles, hinted at a deal that had been in the works for months. The stakes were incredibly high, and the secrecy surrounding the negotiations only added to the tension. The US was seeking the release of Evan Gershkovich, the journalist detained in Russia for over a year. Gershkovich's detention had sparked international outrage, with numerous human rights organizations calling for his immediate release. His case had become a symbol of the broader geopolitical struggle between the two nations. The details of the exchange remained shrouded in secrecy. Behind closed doors, negotiators from both sides were engaged in intense discussions, each trying to secure the best possible outcome for their country. The atmosphere was charged, and every word spoken could tip the balance one way or the other. Sources suggested that the US might be offering a high-value asset in return, perhaps a Russian national held in a US prison on cybercrime charges. This individual was believed to have significant intelligence value, making the exchange even more complex and delicate. The negotiations were said to be delicate and complex, with both sides wary of appearing weak. Each side had its own red lines, and crossing them could derail the entire process. The diplomats involved were seasoned professionals, well aware of the high stakes and the potential repercussions of failure. The potential for a prisoner swap offered a glimmer of hope in what had become a very dark time. Families of those detained were holding their breath, praying for a positive outcome. The possibility of seeing their loved ones again brought a sense of cautious optimism. It was a reminder that even in the midst of conflict, diplomacy could still play a role. The handshake between diplomats symbolized more than just an agreement. It was a beacon of hope that dialogue and negotiation could prevail over hostility and division. The world watched and waited, hoping that this small act of cooperation might signal a thawing of relations between the two superpowers. The outcome of these negotiations could set a precedent for future diplomatic efforts, offering a path forward in an otherwise tumultuous relationship. The eyes of the world were fixed on this unfolding drama, yearning for a resolution that could bring a measure of peace and stability.
It's almost as if history is repeating itself, isn't it? The tension, the uncertainty, it's all very reminiscent of the Cold War era.
Well, absolutely. The geopolitical landscape today is strikingly similar to those times. The alliances, the rivalries, they all seem to echo the past.
And you know, the stakes are incredibly high. Back then, it was about nuclear arms races and ideological supremacy. Today, it's about cyber warfare, economic sanctions, and regional dominance.
Right, and the consequences of these modern conflicts could be just as severe, if not more so. The world is watching closely, and any misstep could lead to significant global repercussions.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and both sides are acutely aware of the potential fallout. It's a high-stakes game, and no one wants to make the wrong move. The geopolitical landscape is incredibly complex right now. Every move made by one country is being closely watched by the others.
Indeed, the recent developments have added a new layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Analysts are trying to understand the potential long-term impacts. As the situation unfolds, reactions from around the world are pouring in.
On the ground here, people are anxious and uncertain about what comes next. There's a palpable sense of tension.
The Russian government maintains that their actions are justified and in line with their national interests. They urge other nations to consider the broader context.
The uncertainty is not just limited to the immediate region, it has global implications.
As a citizen, I just want peace and stability. It's hard to see a clear path forward right now.
From a military perspective, the situation could escalate quickly if not managed carefully. There are several potential flashpoints that could trigger a larger conflict.
In these tense times, the call for dialogue and diplomacy grows louder. Many hope that through conversation and negotiation, a peaceful resolution can be achieved.